the very beginning of it, there's so many people to mention in the history of cinema action, but there was a French film which had been made by French student filmmakers, and it had covered everything from the Beaux-Arts to the factory occupations to everything. And there was this amazing guy, Richard Mordaunt, who had in Mayfair whole marvelous editing suites and little cinemas and everything else. And we managed to get the French, a loan of the French film, and asked Richard if we could use his screening room, and showed the film, invited all sorts of people found in the telephone directory who were pretty famous playwrights and everything else like that. They came, asked for money to buy the film, and the very, very first thing we did, and then I'll stop all the history bit, the very, very first thing was contacting Ford Dagenham, who were on strike, and asking them would they be interested in seeing a film about France in French. And they said, yeah, absolutely, come, please come. So I went. Richard provided a projector, like he did many other things in the end for cinema action. And so I went and did a sort of continuous translation of the French of everything that was going on in France, in the factories, the theatres, and everything else like it. So that was sort of the very, very first thing, the very first, so to speak, event. And that led us to be sort of like recommended, and then the beginning was getting people together to join cinema action. It was only making cine tracts for £5, £5, because we went on showing, because I was able to buy the French film. So the French film went around everywhere, Liverpool, everywhere, minus everything, with a continuous French translation. And that led us to think we must make these small cine tracts about what was happening here. And so we started with cine tracts. And then I first of all should thank you for coming. I think it's amazing that you came, and amazing that we can show these films. You're talking about 40 years, like way, way back.
But they're still so relevant and pertinent now, I think.
That's what I'm finding. And also what's interesting is that, for instance, in Portugal, they were showing So That You Can Live. That wasn't me suggesting that they should see So That You Can Live. It was a French filmmaker who I didn't know, who had somehow seen So That You Can Live way back and had included it in his selection. But what was for me a great pleasure today was actually seeing Squatters, and it really was, and that is a long time ago. So you've got the. There's so many.
It's so relevant to today.
It's so relevant today, and it doesn't matter where one looks with cinema action films. Now the whole thing of London and the housing and the costs and everything else like that. Mm-hmm. And then also in between there were huge struggles. Obviously miners.
The dockers.
But the dockers, and then the Glasgow shipyards, where they didn't just occupy, they did a work in. They kept building ships, and they kept, the press and everyone was shut out. We were inside with them and were filming everything. We're allowed into every meeting of conveners and shop stewards. So there is a long history, and well, okay, history keeps coming around, doesn't it? We go round and round and round. But I hope, especially with these films, that they're not a lament. They're actually still a call to action, I think. I hope you all think too. Anyway, somebody else.
Well, I think watching things from history reminds you what's possible and how maybe how films were made at a certain point and how people were organised at certain points,
Exactly.
and that does have an impact today as well. I think it's not just looking back. But could you maybe say something a bit about the idea of being a collective, like being a film collective, which was that was unusual,
Well,
and what was the sort of thinking around that, and how did that work in practice as well?
Well, that of course is tremendously important to cinema action, but other and not only from cinema action, because from cinema action you had cinema action members that went and then founded other workshops. You had Amber Films up. Amber Films was really you had the experimental films, and more of the collective workshops were tremendously important. And it's one of the things that I wish I spent a lot of time talking about collectives, because it's very hard, very, very hard work, but it's there's nothing like a collective. Come on, Steve, please help me out. I'm talking myself to death here.
Well, Steve was here with the Mark Carlin film, for example, a few weeks ago.
And he was here a few weeks ago
Yes,
with the Mark Carlin,
Yeah,
okay.
who was also an early member of
Cinema Action, yes, a lot.
No, well, actually, what you were just talking about, I think one interesting thing actually about, say, the present and the past is, and the idea of collectives, is probably the idea that the difficult. I think it's quite interesting when something is quite difficult to do, like if you talk, for instance, the first film where it's sound over, or even the second film, which was a more difficult film to make in the sense that a lot of cinema action films were about, and I certainly got involved in cinema action initially, they were about giving voice to working people and sort of militants involved in struggle, as it were.
Point of production.
This was a later film when it becomes more difficult, that situation, because there's been a sort of receding, in a sense, of that, and it's trying to grapple with perhaps more difficult questions. And it kind of forces you into a situation where you have to find forms and find a way of making a film. Because the second film, for instance, So That You Can Live, is very much developed on, isn't it? Very much developmental in terms of the way, just the approach of filmmaking, even, etc.
Yeah.
But it comes out of, I think, that process of being in a difficult situation. And if you relate that back to the question of, say, working as a collective, I think it's quite interesting that when you're forced into that situation where it's quite expensive to make films at that point in time, the issue of collective, I think, is connected as well to the idea of ownership of the means of production.
Exactly.
You would have ownership of the means of production. You would be able to control what you were doing. You weren't beholden to outside funding agencies, etc. In that sense, but that difficulty throws together people and forces people into a situation of having to work together, having to communicate, come together, etc., etc. Whereas today, possibly, it's kind of people can almost individually and independently work. They're not forced into that kind of situation. I think often those issues of difficulty create creativity, create the means of coming together and finding ways of doing things. Yeah.
Well, one of the things I've sort of read is that when you shared equipment as a collective, but also that you made the equipment available freely to other filmmakers. The actual, there's the films, there's the political impact of them, but there's also this kind of other sphere to the work as well.
Yeah, no, that I mean, as Steve said, I mean, it's the, film cost a fortune back then in 68, 69. Now people go around and film miles and then have to edit miles. Well, we had to film and plan very much, but the whole thing was absolutely clear from the beginning that the means of production were absolutely critically essential for filmmakers who had no money, and yet it was a very expensive thing to do. There again, I mentioned Richard Mordaunt, because all that wonderful equipment from his place, in the end, when he left England, he gave to Cinema Action. So we had Steenbecks, we had Eclair cameras, we had Nagras, we had sound transfer, and anyone and everyone. I mean, there are all sorts of people who've made some films there. At Cinema Action, and the door was always open, and they could use it. And I think that really was also, that makes a collective, because you had the means of production, you had an open door, and people could come and could make films. Yeah, no, it was very important.
And just think about your audience as well. I mean, the films were mainly shown, or predominantly shown, in union meetings and in workplaces.
Well, they were shown all over. I mean, that again, I always remember the day when the doorbell rang, and this was right at the beginning, and I opened the door, and there was brand new box with a brand new 16mm projector in it. And I said to the guy, you must have made a mistake, it can't be. And he said, no. And that was Richard again. But we also had a double-headed projector. So we could go with unfinished. I mean, the whole wonderful business of Raymond Williams, to me, was wonderful, was because the country and the city and his writing was so important, and so important to the film. Eventually sort of had enough courage to ring him up, or I can't remember, or write, weren't emails, weren't computers, they say, and asked if we could come and show him this rough cut of a film we were making, which was So That You Can Live. And we went down to Cambridge with a double-headed projector, so it was possible.
So that means the image on one bit, the sound on the other.
So. And so you could show a rough cut. It was a bloody great thing, this double-headed projector. Anyway, showed it to Raymond Williams, and then he wrote some special pieces for the film, which are not from the book, but are pieces which he wrote for the film for us. And so, yeah, showings really, really important, because the whole thing was the discussion afterwards. And I mean, here I am just talking at you. I mean, we didn't.
Well, we should say you come all the way from Portugal, so it's good,
But I mean, please. So the whole point about the discussion was not Cinema Action talking, was the audience talking and contributing. So if there are any...
Well, maybe that's a good chance to open it up.
And it was shown in Wales, yeah, and in Wales it was like that, being shown in the same way as the film from the Clyde would be shown up in the shipyards or the docks or things, but it was shown less. And it was different. I mean, So That You Can Live was different from the films of the shipyards, the mines, the squatters and things. I mean, you're talking several years. Cinema, film from the Clyde was, So That You Can Live was shot over 5 years. So it was, and in that 5 years, it wasn't a question of shooting, a sort of fly on the wall thing of that family. It was keeping in touch with them in between, writing letters. Diane growing up. Diane, one of the things I'll never forget was when she was going to do her exams, she wrote and asked if she could come up and whether I'd help with the revision for what she called British Con, which was British Constitution, obviously, but I loved the British Con. And so that went on over 5 years. In that 5 years, we were making films all the time. So, came the miners or whatever, other films, and we were travelling, showing films, filming, going up, down, and all over the country, and then just going there. So it was very different, in a way, to the industrial films.
Was it shown on Channel 4?
Yeah, I keep forgetting this, sorry. It was the opening day of Channel 4, yes, I fancy forgetting. Yeah, so the opening showing of Channel 4 was So That You Can Live With It. So it was very different from, in many ways, the other films. And then, sorry.
Sorry.
No.
Well, I mean, Steve mentioned, the sort of how maybe relationships with unions and the power of the union changed over the years, but what was it that led you to make this sort of slightly different type of film over many years? And if you...
Yes.
Because there was another project that connected to it, wasn't there?
Yeah, well, there was the social we were being supported, I think it's by the BFI, it's an awful long time ago all this, for a film called The Social Contract. And we had gone to Wales, not to Shirley, not to the equal pay, but to another strike in another valley, a whole another valley. And we were filming that for the social contract, and the social contract was going to go all around the country and be a big film. And as we were leaving, I heard one of the shop stewards saying to another shop steward, shouldn't we go and maybe see if how the women are doing? So I said, what women is that? And they said, it's in another valley, there's some women on an equal pay strike. So we went there, and I can't really, you saw Shirley, right? We went as we normally would go, Pickett and Steve was also, and something sort of made us suggest that we would go home on the bus with her and then go in, and then, as I say, that family made the different film, for which we're really grateful, because one was able then to layer all these experiences, cultural, political, social, cultural, economic, and everything else, which then was put together as the film.